Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. And if it's Sunday, then it's time for the Bach Cantata SCHLEP. And right now, we're up to BWV number 6. Cantata number 6 out of 199 or 200 and something, depending on whether you include the secular cantatas and other revisions and additions and emendations. Wow. So, BWV6. This is called, this one, Bleib bei uns, denn es will Abend werden. In other words, stay with us because it's becoming evening. The darkness surrounds us and is quickly encroaching on our lives, making us miserable. That's the point, isn't it? Anyway, this is a cantata that is quite different from some of the others that we've heard. Some of the others, we've only done 5, but you know what I mean, 40 or 50 or, several dozen others that Bach wrote. What's different about this cantata is that it is not a chorale cantata. Now, as you may recall, a chorale cantata is a cantata in which most of the material in the cantata is derived from a single Lutheran chorale, which is presented as a choral chorale fantasia at the opening. And then some verses of it are usually sung also at the end. In between, there are various arias and recitatives and other doodads going on. This particular cantata is not that. But on the other hand, although it's technically not a chorale cantata, it has more chorales in it than some of the chorale cantatas. Now, how do we explain this paradox? Well, it ends with a chorale. It just does not end with the chorale Bleib bei uns, denn es will Abend werden. Why? Because Bach apparently didn't have a librettist, or he didn't have much control over what the text was. And so the piece begins with that text, which actually is not technically the text of a chorale, although it's very similar to the text of a chorale. So that chorale pops up as the third movement, and then it ends with a different chorale. So you actually get 2 different chorales. And that means that because you get 2 different chorales, this is not a chorale cantata. Does that make sense to you? If not, then we're all in good company, because I have no idea what these people are talking about or why it matters, and I really don't care. And I suggest that neither should you. In fact, in doing some research in the Bach literature on these cantatas, I have become extremely irritated with the way Bach is presented to us as the composer of these lovely, lovely works. And they are lovely works. They're beautiful works. Because, every single note and twidget and fidgy thing and figuration and doodad that he sticks in these things is supposed to have some deep quasi-programmatic and theological meaning. And not only is that not immediately audible in any way, shape, or form, the very idea is ridiculous in my view. I mean, Bach was a great, great, great composer. That doesn't mean he has to be a great poet, a great theologian, a great philosopher. I mean, he just doesn't have to be. But the Bach industry, I've got to tell you, there is a Bach industry. Believe me, there is a Bach industry. Has a vested interest in trying to convince you that he is so much smarter than the rest of us, to try and browbeat us into submission so that we humbly just worship at the altar of his genius and never stop to question or think, or more importantly, to my way of thinking, to really just listen to what he's presenting to us in a simple and open way. We're supposed to be in awe. Well, I got news for you, folks. I'm not in awe. Not in the slightest bit. The music is very, very beautiful. I respect it enormously. But when you see one of these stupid texts that he routinely has to set for these things, and they're basically, it's like everything you always wanted to know about sin and misery but were afraid to ask. That's his text every single week for 200 weeks. I mean, you just have to call a spade here, It's not great poetry. It's not interesting poetry unless you happen to be seriously Lutheran, but the music itself is wonderful. And I don't understand why it's a crime to suggest that Bach, as a composer, just threw up his hands and said, okay, here we go again. Another weekly cantata. This is my job, and I'm going to write the most beautiful music that I possibly can. And not everything has to mean something else. That's the way I think we should approach this cantata. And there'll be some musical evidence for this. Believe me, I'm not just making this up out of nowhere. So the structure of this cantata is also rather unusual. And I've already suggested that because it contains two different chorales. It begins, as most of these cantatas do, with a chorus. But instead of a chorale fantasia, that is a chorale tune in long notes with choral counterpoint all around it, this particular cantata begins with an independent choral movement that sets the text, stay with us, for night is coming and the day is ending. That's the text. I think it's important when listening to this cantata to understand, although the images of light and day are kind of cliched when it comes to these sort of religious sentiments, Jesus is the light and the word of God is the light and darkness is sin and misery and Satan and hell and, those are the images, the opposing images. But I think it would do well for us to recall just how terrifying night really was back in Bach's day. Remember, there was no artificial illumination readily available, even in a city like Leipzig. Street lighting only happened, I think, it started during Bach's lifetime somewhat, but darkness was dark. Unless the moonlight was shining in an open window, it was dark, and it was dark indoors because you could not leave a fire burning anywhere. You had open flames. That's all it was. Chances are you'd never wake up if you left your candle going. So you take your disgusting tallow candle or whatever it was, a smoky, nauseating, stinking, dim little thing to wherever your bedroom was, and you'd blow it out and jump in bed. And that was the last thing you saw until the sun came up in the morning. And if you had to get up, if you were stuck outside, it was dark. And darkness was something to be feared. It truly was. And I think that some of the fear of darkness that Bach manages to write into his music is quite evident. And I think that is something that we can understand, something that Bach could represent musically. And he does it, of course, in the most obvious possible way, not by writing little, descending figures and, chromatic bass lines and whatnot, but by writing music in a minor key that sounds dark. I mean, darkness is dark. And, dark is minor. Light is major. Happiness, sadness. Get it? That's how music operates. And Bach, of course, was very good at that. But boy, to try and take, as the literature does, every single little, 3 notes descending or 2 notes ascending, that means, specifically, suggested by the text, the darkness brought on by the wages of sin and the this and that. It's so crazy, the things people say about this stuff. Let me play you a little bit of this opening chorus. It is an exquisite chorus, and it has a very interesting form. I'm going to play you the opening, but it's actually a slow, fast, slow chorus, which suggests sort of the French overture form, such as at the beginning of Handel's oratorios, where you have sort of a stately procession at the beginning, and then a quick contrapuntal passage in the middle, and then a return to the more stately aspect, like the first movement of the Royal Fireworks music. That is in that form, the same form as this overture, actually. It's quite beautiful. And as usual, we have Helmut Rilling's Bach Academy Stuttgart edition of the complete cantatas on Haenssler Classic. Here's the opening chorus. Take a listen. beautiful, isn't it? I mean, these opening choruses are just miraculously gorgeous. And, the orchestration of this particular cantata is quite wonderful because it features a trio of oboes, 2 regular oboes, and our old friend, the oboe da caccia, the hunting oboe, which has a tone quite like that of the English horn. It's a little bit lower, and you could hear it there, I think, in the introductory ritornello before the entry of the voices. And if you couldn't, you're in luck, because the oboe da caccia features extensively in the second number, which is an aria for alto about light versus darkness. All of the texts in this cantata are basically the same, and so we don't really need to talk about them in any detail at all. There is actually very little poetic imagery other than that for Bach to draw on. Really nothing when you think about it. I mean, if you actually read the words, you can look them up and read them if you want, if you're that excited about it. But the fact of the matter is that besides light and darkness in this basic opposition, there is nothing in this text that gives Bach anything to hang his programmatic hat on. And that's why all the talk about the things he does to represent these theological and philosophical ideas just strikes me as absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, the alto aria begins with a long ritornello for the oboe da caccia. Ooh, what a bear this thing must be to play. This poor oboe da caccia player has to play constantly throughout the entire aria, and it's a da capo aria. That is an ABA aria with the return of the A section theoretically ornamented. It's really, really a chore. It's a monster of an aria. Listen to the opening. I mean, you'll see exactly what I mean, and pity the oboe da caccist. I mean, wow. Take a breath. Why don't we? It's, it's one of the other things about Bach that kind of, gets me is that everyone talks about, well, he was such a genius of orchestral color and this and that. It's like, no, he writes for every instrument like every other instrument. And he writes for the voices like he writes for every instrument. He just expected everybody to do everything, period. That's about it. Now, the third movement is this other chorale, and it is quite beautifully set. Again, the chorale is close to the actual text of the opening chorus, but this is the chorale version. The words are slightly different. We don't need to bother with the differences because the sense is the same, and it's it's Ach, Bleib bei uns, Jesu Christ, one of those things. But it's because night's coming and you stay with us and we need you, and that kind of thing. But here's the point. This particular chorale setting is given to the soprano, who sings the verses of the chorale separated by completely independent material and a really wacky solo for an instrument called the violoncello piccolo, a little cello, which Bach liked because it was a little cello with an higher upper range extension so that he could write higher notes. And this particular solo may sound something like the oboe da caccia solo that we just heard, because as I said, everything that Bach writes for any instrument sounds like everything else he wrote for every other instrument. And why he had to write this really busy, really, really busy virtuosic solo for the violoncello piccolo to illustrate this text is anybody's guess. And it's just as legitimate, rather than racking your brains and trying to check out this completely uninteresting text for the one word of illumination that sort of explains to you why this poor instrumentalist is going chicka 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 chicka, you know, like most Baroque music always does, whether it's by Bach or anybody else. Why can't we just admit that Bach just wrote the most beautiful and interesting music he possibly could to accompany the lovely, lovely soprano solo intoning the lines of the chorale? Here it is. Listen and decide for yourself. It's really quite lovely and very arresting, isn't it? I mean, it keeps you awake. For me, that's a good enough reason if you're going to be sitting through something in church and listening to this stuff for Bach to do what he did. He doesn't have to be a theological genius. All he has to be is a musical genius. And I'll take that any day. I really will. Now, after the chorale setting, there's a recitative for the bass, which is, of course, all about the bass. So it's all about darkness and sin and misery and horror and all that stuff. And then there's a tenor aria, which basically, asks that Jesus allow us to gaze on him and illuminate our, senses with the light of salvation. You could make up the words as well as I could. And this is, I think, a very, very beautiful aria because, first of all, it has a very short ritornello. You'll notice how some of them have like really long, they go on forever before the voice comes in. Well, this one's really peppy, and it's for tenor and the full string section, and it's really beautiful and lush and warm and romantic. It's absolutely gorgeous. Now there's a sort of steady what you might call a walking bass, constant bass line, which is supposed to represent walking or something happening. I don't know. It's very, very pretty. Here is the opening of the tenor aria. Beautiful, isn't it? Really beautiful. I mean, genuinely beautiful. Does it have to be anything other than genuinely beautiful? That's what I can't wrap my brain around, because I really did, when I was looking at this cantata, and I do a little research for these talks because frankly this is as much a voyage of discovery for me as it is for you. I know some of them really well. Do I know all 200 equally well? No, of course not. And some of the less familiar ones, I want to know more about them. And reading about them, when I read all this falderall that's said about them, I listen to it, I think, wow, that's really, really beautiful. And for me, that's the reason to listen to it. And I suspect it will be for you too. Now, this cantata ends, as I said, with a different chorale in a minor key. So, as usual, it ends with, glumness and misery, first and foremost in our minds. It asks for God's protection against the wages of sin, as usual. But it gets the job done quite beautifully. And like I said, what I would like you to take away from this particular chat, we're going to encounter many Bach cantatas where we do see that he has a miraculous response to the imagery of the text. We've already seen some of those, to the pastoral imagery, to the opportunity to portray, the morning star and the countryside and all of the things that music can do. And what Bach was an incredible master at was just that, at doing things that music naturally wanted to do. Music does not naturally wish to express the minutiae of Lutheran theology, or every illustrate every single noun. Anything that's a noun. Music only does nouns. It doesn't do adjectives. It can do adverbs like quickly or slowly. No, but seriously, it doesn't have to illustrate every word with a musical object motivic equivalent. It doesn't. And I really think that if you think of it that way, if you look at what people say about it, that is the path toward frustration. I only speak for myself and say it's one of the reasons I've always been very hesitant to approach this music, because I find it very intimidating. I find what people write about it to be very intimidating. Why? Because they describe all this stuff that it's doing and that I'm supposed to hear, and then I put it on and I hear a lovely Baroque tenor aria. And that's it. And it's enough. It's enough. You've heard some of these arias, these pieces. They're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful, because Bach was a great composer. And it's enough that he gave us incredibly beautiful music in response, generally speaking, to the texts that he was called upon to set. And it's with that thought that I would like to leave you until our next Bach cantata SCHLEP. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me, and SCHLEP on. Bye-bye.